Join us on a journey where we unravel the latest trends, tackle your burning questions, and explore innovative strategies that are shaping the future of compensation, all with a cup of coffee in hand. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Comp and Coffee. I'm Ruth Thomas, Chief Compensation Strategist here at PayScale and host of the podcast. Today, we're talking about pay transparency, which is very much no longer a future trend. It's really here, and we know you are all working within your organizations to try and deal with that. We know the story has been a lot about compliance, but it isn't only about compliance, and that's really kind of what we want to dig into here today. It's really also a conversation around trust. Employees want to see more than just numbers on a page. They want to understand a story that connects fairness, compliance, and business outcomes. And we know that right now, many organizations are struggling to find that shared language around pay and around pay transparency. And that's what today's episode is all about, turning pay transparency into practice, moving it from legal obligation to cultural conversations. So joining me today, I have two wonderful guests, welcoming back both of them to the podcast. Lulu Seikaly is our senior corporate attorney here at PayScale, and welcome to Elena Van Kirk, who's principal consultant at Exude Human Capital. Welcome back, Elena. Do you want to just briefly introduce yourself to the audience, Elena? Do you want to start us off?
Elena Van Kirk, principal consultant at Exude Human Capital. Happy to be back on the podcast. At Exude, we really work across the HR, leadership development, and inclusive culture space. And so I love being in the comp space to focus on equity and transparency.
Thank you. Lulu, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank y'all so much for tuning in to the Comp and Coffee podcast. I am Lulu Seikaly. I am a senior corporate attorney here at PayScale. Outside of most of my job is to advise our people team on kind of internal employment and HR related matters from the legal perspective. But I also work very, very closely with Ruth and the marketing team, where I track all things legislation, whether it has to do most recently with pay transparency legislation here and across the pond. Also pay equity legislation. And if you guys have caught Ruth and myself on one of our webinars, we are...
Hey everybody, Tim Sackett, host of HR Famous, a new podcast on the Work Defined Network. Am I famous? No, I'm HR famous. My wife says I'm a micro celebrity, and 13 HR ladies around the world want their picture with me, which I think is funny. So, hey, what do we talk about on the pod? We talk about all the dumb stuff we do in HR in any given day, week, month, and we have fun with it, and we have some great guests. Come check us out. We're not famous. We're HR famous.
We've got our little choreography down pat for our webinars. So happy to be back with my partner in crime here, Ruth Thomas, for this podcast.
Great. Thank you, Lulu. Okay, so let's get going. We're going to talk around a little bit about pay transparency and how it relates to compliance. So we know pay transparency is all about open communication around pay and open communication with employees, potential employees, managers. But we often approach these conversations from different perspectives. So now there are so many more stakeholders and they all have different views around pay. HR talks about pay fairness and equity, but legal, sorry, Lulu, talks about compliance and risk management. Leadership talks about cost or key talent retention. And really, employees, they just want clarity. So let's unpack why these groups so often tend to speak past each other. So, Lulu, I called you out there as the lawyer. What's your view in terms of, is pay transparency just a compliance issue?
I mean, clearly it's a compliance issue. That is very, very important. This evolving legal landscape is challenging, especially for stakeholders, internal stakeholders, to function well with. I'm in a unique position, and so are many other in-house attorneys, where they now understand that while legal compliance is important, getting the business to where they need to go from a business perspective is equally as important. There are risks to non-compliance from the legal perspective. The biggest risk, of course, are lawsuits, and that's very expensive. But pay transparency, and I talk about this a lot on my LinkedIn with Ruth during webinars at conferences, talked about it with Elena last year at conference when we did a session together. But it's not just about avoiding lawsuits, and it's not just about compliance. There is so many other opportunities to be transparent and have that be a benefit to your organization. It's helpful for trust, for equity, most importantly for reputation. And that's something that we talk about a lot at PayScale is, okay, if you are fine rolling the dice and seeing if you're going to get a lawsuit, what about your reputation? And social media is now much more prominent than ever. There are so many folks out there who are willing to call organizations out on social media to harm their reputation because they're not being transparent. They're not being open. The best thing that we do at PayScale is we do a lot of research. Ruth's team does a lot of research. And most recently, we released the Fair Pay Impact Report. And in that report, especially if you're an organization that needs leadership buy-in to be transparent and be compliant with these new laws, is that we found that employees do not perceive that pay is fair, even when it is, and they're more likely to leave that organization because of it. So our 2025 Fair Pay Impact Report does show that wages are actually fairer now than they were in 2021, but the perception of fair pay has actually gotten worse. So employees who think that they are being paid below market are actually 45% more likely than those who think they're being paid at or above market to look for a new job in the next 6 months. And we could talk about this on a completely separate podcast, why that is, why employee perception that they're not being paid fairly is the way it is now versus, 4 or 5 years ago. But that's for another day, I imagine. And then we also recently received the Pay Confidence Gap Report. And on the other end, so we say employees don't think they're being paid fairly. Well, in our Pay Confidence Gap Report, we actually found that employers have greater trust that employees understand their pay decisions than is reflected in how much they trust their employers' decisions about pay. So, and that trust gap is huge. It's 24%, which is glaring. And I know Ruth and I have talked about this a lot.
Yeah, well, thanks, Lulu, for referencing those reports. And I think, that Pay Confidence Gap Report really just shows the difference of opinion in pay transparency between two of these stakeholders that we want to talk about today, between employers and employees. Elena, from your perspective, how do these mismatched messages between the different stakeholders about pay create confusion or trust ultimately for employees?
Mm-hmm. One of the things that comes to mind is really, I think there's this disconnect between on the legal legislative side, right? We have to be transparent, and we think that requiring transparency is going to generate or create equity, when really on my side, what I tend to see a lot is that organizations that are in fact equitable in practice have a much greater time being transparent. And so you end up with a little of this, like, who comes first situation. Do we focus on transparency versus do we focus on equity? And one of the things that I agree with you in that, how do we make sure that we're fostering trust, and how do we understand what's eroding trust to begin with? And I think that's also, if you start at the very beginning, think about some of those practices. What are we posting as a range versus what are we hiring at within that range? What's employees' natural behavior and how I interpret a range, and how does that equate to my value and my contribution? And so there's a lower end and an upper end, and where does everybody want to be? So when we think about what's the context that we're setting when we start to tell that story, from posting a range to where we're hiring at and how we're making decisions from there, I think there's a lot that is not said. We're going to pay commensurate with experience. What does that mean? Your job description requires general experience and a whole bunch of skills. So I think the pieces that aren't unsaid and the context and the clarity we're not creating is really what is fostering a lot of that confusion, which is ultimately what's eroding trust.
Yeah, that's a great point of view, because there's a lot of complexity in the language of compensation. And maybe, we as comp specialists or in HR, we think we know that language. But maybe that's not, we maybe need to translate that in terms of sometimes how we're talking to employees. Sorry, Lulu, I cut you off there.
You're fine. I was just going to say that confusion from a legal perspective could also lead to lawsuits, right? That could lead to unintended discrimination lawsuits, unintended pay equity lawsuits. So, I mean, that confusion, obviously is important for attracting and retaining the best talent and empowering your managers to understand why, folks are being paid the way they're being paid. But that could also in turn cause, a bigger headache for your legal teams, because those could be the basis for some pretty strong lawsuits.
Yeah. So it's important to get this right. It's important to make sure that kind of everybody's, understanding is at a common level as we have these more open conversations about pay. So I think moving on from that, I think we seem to be in agreement that compliance is the floor, not the ceiling, when it comes to talking about pay transparency. How do we move from checking boxes to creating real alignment around pay transparency? So from your perspective, Lulu, what can legal teams do to frame transparency in a way that supports and doesn't stifle culture?
I'll say it again. Transparency should not be just about compliance. As in-house counsel, and I really encourage a lot of in-house counsel that we come across with our customers on, which is that as attorneys, of course, compliance is very important. But internally, as a business stakeholder in that organization, we should be the advocates about building a fair and equitable workplace, not just because the law tells us to, but because that's good for business. Fair and equitable workplaces is good for business. It's not just about checking a box. It's about, reinforcing who you are as an organization, figuring out who you are as an organization. Are we going to treat our folks well? Do we want people to stay here, for their entire career? Are we okay with a lot of attrition? That's important for your organization to understand before kind of entering this phase of, how you're going to be transparent about your pay. But pay transparency, back to Elena's point earlier, can really help you proactively explain why the ranges exist, how pay decisions are made, not having any confusion amongst the business organizations, right? So like HR and your comp teams are aligned with your legal teams, which are aligned with your finance teams about this is the range that we've chosen. We decided not to go above or below that range, or, there's some wiggle room because we're not posting the full range, et cetera. But, when employees understand why they're being paid the way they're being paid, they're more likely to trust the organization. They're more likely to stay, even if they think they should be paid more. And in this day and age, social media and AI, there's so much information, also misinformation for employees out there to go seek and say like, hey, as an entry-level software engineer, I should be paid $300,000 because some influencer on TikTok told me I should be. That's a lot of misinformation. That's not realistic in, I would say, 90% of organizations. But, at the same time, speaking to all my other in-house attorneys out there who are listening, us as legal teams, we are at our best when we can help translate kind of those compliance rules into values. So framing pay transparency as a cultural strength rather than a compliance burden, rather than like, we're going to get sued if we don't do this, that's kind of the best solution. And that is kind of the language that the business is able to understand, as opposed to us lawyers always saying no and always saying we're going to get sued, trying to work and massage that language with the organization to get them to that compliance. So at this point, not only will an organization avoid legal risk, but they'll actually deepen the trust and engagement from their employees at the same time.
Yeah. And as you say, both of those are important for business. So if you're a business-focused lawyer, then you kind of want to be focused on that as well. So, and Elena, what role does HR play in making transparency feel like a practice rather than just something written on paper or a compliance policy?
I think it's really bringing to life what Lulu said. It's that it's so much more than just having a process, but also making sure that there is transparency to why this is our practice and what are the pieces of individuals that influence pay. What are the pieces of roles and structure here at our organization that influence pay, to the process, to the decisions. Also, every employee should understand how they can influence their own earning potential or salary growth. So whether that is in moving throughout the organization, whether that is in expanding their own knowledge, skills, experience, their capacity to create value at the organization. To me, it's really transparency on the individual side to how do I move and how do I make sure that I feel comfortable and confident that as I grow and contribute and add more value, that I'm also then going to be recognized for those contributions with compensation. And so that really means that we all have to be having this conversation. Most employees don't get to self-navigate their own career through an organization. So how can HR teams really support organizational leaders in talking about jobs and talking about scope and talking about responsibility? And I also think transparency and equity as a practice means saying no. It means being really comfortable in saying no, that equity and equality are two different things. And making sure that we are consistent in the criteria that influence comp, as well as being consistent in the criteria that don't. And I think sometimes that can be really uncomfortable because there's this perception of, oh, but they're doing X, Y, and Z, or they have X, Y, and Z. But if that's not criteria we use for all of our other employees, we need to be really careful about protecting the integrity of our compensation model, our philosophy, and the factors that we use to make decisions consistently.
That was great, Elena. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, a lot of common sense there, and really just that understanding of, if we're going to make it a practice, really upskilling managers, because they're the ones that are going to be, at the front end in terms of communicating with employees. And that's something we haven't always felt comfortable doing. I remember I talked to a lot of practitioners, and that when we've talked initially about like enabling managers to have pay conversations, they're like, but we don't trust our managers. We don't trust our managers to have open conversations. And I think that's a shift we're definitely having to make. So really, we are talking about this building a universal language around pay. If we want employees to believe in our pay practices, we do need one message that resonates across HR, legal, finance, and leadership. So from your practical experience, Elena, what's one thing that you've seen that really unites stakeholders around a common message?
I think the unification factor is the confidence in having a common message if we have clarity that that common message meets all of the needs of each of those stakeholders. So going back to Lulu's point about consistency in our practice being compliant, that it can manage the financial liability of our organization, that from an HR standpoint, employees are engaged and we can recruit and we can retain, and that from a leader's standpoint, they get people who are engaged in contributing value and who feel success and want to stay and grow with the organization. If we can meet each of those needs with our framework and our universal language, I think there's just more comfort and confidence and collaboration that's naturally going to happen. Part of that is educating managers to not just talk about pay, but to talk about jobs, to talk about work, to be able to understand differences in calibration in the value of contributions as we've scoped them and how we're building them and creating our workforce and delivering on organizational goals. I also think the other side of that is understanding the value and the role of compensation in our whole landscape. And not, I think, just from a total reward standpoint, but from a recognition standpoint. What is the role of compensation? How much of compensation is our statutory requirement, and how much of compensation is really reward and recognition and a growth model for employees to be able to deliver reciprocal value to organizational growth or goal achievement.
Great. So it's telling the whole story really here around, what are the rules around pay? How do we all want to think about pay? But then how is that in the bigger context of total rewards and even your employee value proposition? And also this being very much a cultural conversation as well. And Lulu, like thinking about universal language, how do you advise companies to balance transparency with risk management without creating fear? Like, how would you do that?
Again, framing pay transparency as a reflection of your organization's value. So it feels purposeful and deliberate, as opposed to we're just doing this because our legal teams are telling us to. Another thing that we do, and we talk about this a lot internally at PayScale, and our chief people officer says this a lot, is that pay transparency is a journey. We're not just going to do it one time. It's not a Band-Aid fix. This is something that's inherent into our organization's values. It's something that's important to us. We are acknowledging the importance of being transparent about pay because we know it's going to attract the best talent, retain the best talent, and that we know that our employees are going to trust us more. I think Ruth talks about this quite a bit, which is like, you can't get to pay transparency without first encouraging organizations to come up with their pay philosophy or their compensation philosophy, because that's a good starting point to get to those values that are going to lead you to deciding to being transparent about pay. Figuring out your structures, getting your house in order, making sure you have clear salary ranges before you just post your ranges for the world to see when you're hiring for a job. And those things can expand over time, but just starting little by little to get to that point is really important for organizations, and organizations will see such a big difference in the quality of the quality of the talent they're bringing in, the amount of employees who are still staying, and then equipping managers to combat misinformation is going to be super key. We don't want a healthy organization with transparent values and those who really, really, really want to keep their employees happy and stay with the organization. They're going to be the ones who are equipping their managers to be able to have these conversations, and not just having the manager send the employee to the comp person to go complain about their pay. Similar to what Elena was talking about earlier, is, really getting employees to really own kind of like their movement in the organization. But at the same time, the organization has to meet them halfway as well. So having these conversations and being more transparent about pay is going to make these conversations easier. And especially if you're going to equip your managers to have these conversations instead of having HR do them all the time.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so we've talked a lot here today so far about how we can get to this point of making pay transparency become part of the living, breathing organizations that you work within, and how you can embed it within culture, and how we can think about it commonly across a group of stakeholders. If we think about that pay as a universal language going forward, Lulu, how do you think that's going to evolve? Is it going to stay where we're at? Do you think it's going to advance? What are your thoughts on that relative to, say, potentially how legislation is evolving?
Yeah. And I think, this year, I know a lot of our customers are kind of, we've been hearing from our customers a lot how disappointed they've been in kind of how pay transparency laws have slowed down a bit this year. Not in terms of lawmakers understanding the value of bringing forth those laws to the floor, but the fact that we're not seeing as many pass. And I think that's just a lot of the political system. But we think organizations are going to start settling around this high watermark in terms of pay transparency practice, whether the law requires them to or not. We are hearing more and more, especially from our customers, that they are taking kind of a one approach to pay transparency. They're posting ranges everywhere, even if they don't have to legally, because they understand kind of the importance of it. We get questions all the time like, well, we have a dozen states that have pay transparency laws in place. How the heck are we supposed to comply with them all? Our suggestion is always like, hey, take a look at the most complex, the law that's requiring you to do the most, and just take that law and apply it across the board. Because for the most part, these lawmakers are not reinventing the wheel. It's not going to be easy. We acknowledge this. It's not going to be easy, especially if you don't have your house in order. I'm sure Elena has a lot of her clients that come to her and have nothing in place, and it's overwhelming and it's expensive to kind of get everyone's house in order. But these are key building blocks that have to be put into place before you can get to that point. But I'd like to think in time, we won't even question whether or not pay transparency exists. It's just going to be it's like, I think Ruth gives this example, which is, you're not going to go to an open house and look at a home if you have no idea what the asking price is for that home. Like, you're not going to go in and find out that the home is $500,000 over your budget. That's silly. I think pay transparency is going to be like that in just, I would say, probably 5 years. Maybe I'm too optimistic, but we'll see.
And Elena, are you optimistic, pessimistic? How do you see this pay as a universal language evolving?
I have to be optimistic because I care so much about this space. I think it really is. I love the words we've used throughout this is making it a practice. And making it a practice means everyone has to practice. And so whatever your role is here, whatever department you sit on or which side of that table or employee-employer relationship you're on, everybody has a muscle. And we've really got to practice this muscle of understanding how to talk about pay, how to talk about work, what the whole purpose behind this is, and keeping that perception front and center. Lulu knows more than anyone that perception is what's either going to, bring employees to you and keep employees with you, or what potentially is going to land you in a lawsuit. It's perception first, it's documentation and burden of proof later. And so if we can close that gap across all places where we can bring together perception with documentation, with clarity is really what it is, closing that gap between perception and clarity by being consistent and everybody learning how to flex that same muscle, even in a little bit of a different way. I think you'll have far more cohesion and synergy between players at an organization. And that alone is going to present that united front and that consistency and will create the trust instead of eroding it at the onset of those relationships.
Yeah, so I think it's all the stakeholders working together, and everybody kind of like working together for what is very important. Essentially, employee trust is the magic that you can get in an organization. If you don't have trust, then things like productivity, innovation, and achieving business outcomes are very hard. So I think, really thinking about that link between how pay transparency drives that trust is critical, and all stakeholders working together is what I've heard. And I think I like that comment you were saying, Lulu, about like the high watermark. I think as we see legislation evolve, particularly with maybe some of the influence from the requirements in the EU under the Pay Transparency Directive, we may see that, pay transparency really just becomes part of every day. We don't actually think about we're having to be pay transparent. It's been built into our policies. It's been built into our practices. So we know that, from the time someone is hired in an organization through to like the times they're talking to their managers about pay and career progression, that is all just happening naturally. And no one really questions like, oh, well, was there a time when we weren't transparent? That's what I hope we get to eventually. So today's conversation has really showed us that pay transparency is more than publishing ranges or just about compliance. It's about alignment across the stakeholders, across leadership, across teams, and with employees. And without that shared language, transparency really is likely to fall flat. And with it, organizations build trust that endures. So thank you very much, Lulu and Elena, for joining me today and coming back to the podcast. And we will link all the resources on pay transparency and compliance in the show notes and those reports that Lulu mentioned. And we'd really love to hear from you. What's the biggest barrier to pay transparency alignment in your organization? You can email us at coffee@payscale.com. And any suggestions you have for future topics for the podcast, please also drop them there. It's coffee@payscale.com. Thank you all. And thank you, Lulu and Elena. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you.